Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming. My name is Travis Matson. I'm the Transportation Program Director at the Southwest Energy Efficiency Project. And if Anita, you could start sharing the slides. I appreciate all of you attending, and I also would like to thank CDOT, the Energy Office, and the Electrification Coalition for joining today. We're going to be talking a little bit about funding opportunities that exist for electric vehicle infrastructure, including NEVI, but also beyond NEVI. That's the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program that was part of the infrastructure law, but there's a bunch more in the two federal laws that just passed that's going to help accelerate electric vehicle infrastructure deployment in Colorado. So the plan here, if you could go to the next slide. So I'm going to kick us off, followed by Rebecca Saraboff, who's an EV infrastructure associate at the Electrification Coalition. We're also joined by Christian Willis, who's the managing director of the Transportation Fuels and Technologies program at the Energy Office, and Michael King, who is assistant director of electrification and energy at the Office of Innovative Mobility within CDOT. Now, the outline of the talk is on the next slide. I'm going to talk briefly about some of the context, why this is important, why local governments should be thinking about it. Rebecca is releasing a local government playbook today with some information and resources about what local governments can do. So that's exciting. That's a brand new publication that just came out today. Christian will talk a little bit about state programs and resources that are available, and then Michael will talk about CDOT and some of the programs in the bipartisan infrastructure law. And I'm hoping that we'll have ample time for question and answer, but if there's any questions we don't get to or don't know the answer to, we will send a follow-up with information that we can dig up after the talk. Next slide. So the context in Colorado is that I think the transition to electric vehicles is well underway. This is just a couple of headlines from newspapers around the region. There's a ton of new models of light-duty electric vehicles that are for sale in Colorado. I've been seeing some medium and heavy-duty EVs on the road. There's some Ford E-Transit vans, like in the below picture, delivering goods for Walmart. And then transit agencies are starting to deploy increasing amounts of electric buses. This slide shows where Colorado's at in terms of light-duty EV sales. In 2022, we're getting pretty close to reaching 10% of all new light-duty sales as electric vehicles. And I think that puts us on track to reach the governor's goal of 940,000 EVs by 2030, and for most new vehicles, the large majority of new vehicles to be electric during the 2030s. So there's going to be an even faster, more dramatic deployment of EVs in the coming decade, and it's something that local governments are going to have to engage with. Next slide. So a couple of reasons why this is happening. There's a lot of benefits that come from transportation electrification. Drivers can save on vehicle ownership costs. In particular, fuel and maintenance costs are much lower with EVs. We're estimating that in Colorado, the driving savings is worth on the order of $30 to $40 billion in net present value between now and 2050. There's also opportunities to reduce pollution. EVs, especially when they're running on clean energy, produce far less carbon dioxide pollution. The value of that, if we stay on track towards reaching our state climate goals, would be on the order of 20 billion in Colorado through 2050. There's another 10 billion in value associated with reduced emissions that cause health-threatening impacts, asthma, lung cancer, and whatnot. Additionally, plugging in EVs allows us to use our electric system more efficiently, which puts downward pressure on customer rates. We're estimating that electricity customers will pay, on the order of 4 to 5 billion less in rates than they would otherwise without EVs. So that's a substantial benefit. And then drivers, I think, like the vehicles because they're nicer, they're quieter, they have smoother rides. So there's a lot of factors driving this. And then when you throw the Inflation Reduction Act and the bipartisan infrastructure law on top of this, I think we're really going to see a dramatic acceleration in EVs. So what do local governments need to be doing here? Next slide. One thing to think about is everyone who's driving a vehicle of any kind in your communities today, a combustion vehicle, like they're going to want to do the same things with an electric vehicle. And in order to make that possible, we're going to need to install a lot of infrastructure. So about 80% of the charging is going to occur at homes or at commercial hubs where vehicles are based, but we'll also need a bunch of charging that's out there and available to the public. The Energy Office commissioned a study from the International Council for Clean Transportation that estimates we're going to need somewhere in the range of 20,000 more public charging ports needed by 2030. Some of those, a bunch of them will be public level 2. Some of the slower chargers that you might find at a place where a car would linger a longer time. And then we'll need some DC fast chargers, some located along corridors like the NEVI program focuses on, and then also some that are more generally located within communities, say, for example, near some multifamily buildings where folks don't have dedicated parking and need to use fast charging to refuel their vehicles. So local governments are going to be doing a lot of this work. And in the rest of the webinar, we're going to talk about some actions you could take and some funding sources that can help pay for it. And then with that, I'll turn it over to Rebecca on the next slide.
Awesome. Thanks, Travis. Hi, everyone. My name is Rebecca Sarabach. I'm an EV infrastructure associate at the Electrification Coalition. And before I kick off, just a little bit about us. We're a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization that's dedicated to driving the policies and actions that will electrify all modes of transportation to protect economic and national security, public health, and American jobs. And we work with our sister organization, SAFE, or Securing America's Future Energy, to do that based out of Washington, D.C. And while we're based out of Washington, D.C., we actually got our start in Colorado. We were involved in the Drive Electric Northern Colorado campaign. So it's very exciting to be here with you all this afternoon for me, I imagine this morning for you, to chat more about what local governments can do to champion all these funds. So if we go ahead to the next slide, I am really especially excited to share with you our local government playbook, which is, hot off the press. We just released it this morning, and I'm happy to share a bit more about the playbook with you right now. The playbook contains actions and strategies that local governments can enact today, tomorrow, and in the future. And it has best practices, policy approaches, lessons from previous public charging deployments, and some lessons learned too. And it covers all of those actions through policy action, state and regional planning, stakeholder and community engagement, and site planning. So if you go on to the next slide, this is a super high level overview of what's in the playbook, and I'll be sure to send the link to the playbook when we wrap up here today so that you all are able to read it in a bit more depth. But I wanted, if we know we're talking about readiness, just to talk about policy action and state and regional planning and the recommendations that we have there, which go in order in this slide of number 1 is today, number 2 is tomorrow, and number 3 is in the future. That would be creating a policy inventory, building policy agendas, and adopting rigorous policy. And then on the state and regional planning side, which is, I know, of particular interest to folks on this webinar, that would be building relationships, aligning state plans, and then most importantly, creating a roadmap. So again, this slide is just a really, bird's eye view of what's in the playbook that contains all of these recommendations, lessons learned, and best practices for local governments in deploying public charging. So the last slide that I'll share with you now, and then I'm happy to answer some questions going forward, is about EV readiness. So at the EC, we like to think of EV readiness in 2 sort of different ways. The first, and what is both listed first on this slide and should also come first generally, is regional charging deployment preparedness. And we think of that as sort of focus on a variety of EV topics, whether that be charging or fleet electrification, multimodal consumer adoption, et cetera. That's focused on how can we identify immediate action, things that can happen now, and then also use those to sort of build towards longer term plans. And I've put a few examples in the slides below. We just last week published a roadmap with DC. That is a great example of sort of this large deployment preparedness plan. And we also like to point to Pittsburgh's plan as a good example of that. And then I guess the other side of readiness that we like to focus on is EV readiness as an ordinance. So that's, sort of getting into the more policy oriented side. And it is a great next step after planning. And it's focused on policies that we can pass to ensure that things like charging requirements go into new buildings and not, these requirements are included down the road. So the playbook talks a lot more about how to compose those and how to work with other folks to pass them. And, I'll just mention them now and make space for questions later. But some awesome examples that we like to point out in that space are the Orlando charging ordinance. And then of course, our good friends at SWEEP have a wonderful way to track all of these things. So I think I'm going to leave it there and pass it on, and I'll be excited to answer some more questions later. And as we wrap up today, I'll be sure to send the link to the playbook for everybody to read.
All right, I think it's on to me. Hi, everybody. Again, my name is Christian Willis. I'm the Managing Director for Transportation, Fuels, and Technology at the Colorado Energy Office. And I just wanted to start out my comments with this graph. Now, Travis had talked a little bit about the governor's goal of 940,000 electric vehicles. And this is really a graphical representation of what that looks like. As Travis mentioned, we're almost 10% market share on EVs today. He also mentioned that over the next couple of years, we're really going to see those sales accelerate. And I think that's really reflected in this chart here. You can see that between about 2020 and 2024, the growth curve is relatively shallow, but by 2025, we really start to see the beginning of that S curve, where we're seeing really significant amount of electric vehicles sold. We know the goal of 940,000 EVs by 2030 is a really aggressive goal. And I would add to that, we also have a goal of 70% of new EV sales by 2030. But we believe with the right mix of policy and program strategies, we can achieve that goal. Next slide, please. So Rebecca talked a lot about the importance of EV readiness. I want to highlight a handful of resources that are available to communities in Colorado. A couple of years ago, we started kind of an ad hoc offering where we would provide grants to local governments interested in undertaking community EV readiness plans. And we saw some really key benefits were, number one, because we typically saw this as community EV readiness plans that included a city and a county and a utility and other key stakeholders as really helping to create a common vision for EV readiness in a more regional perspective. We found that these plans help to identify those important partnerships as well as actionable strategies that can be undertaken by partners to those EV readiness plans. They can help communities prepare for and stimulate community adoption of electric vehicles, and importantly, help communities lead by example in undertaking the kinds of activities to help electrify their fleets, install charging infrastructure, those sorts of activities. And so in terms of resources, as I mentioned, we've typically had an ad hoc offering. We are going to formalize that in early 2023. We will be releasing a solicitation. It'll be a competitive solicitation, which will provide funding for communities to develop these community EV readiness plans. We anticipate somewhere between about $30,000 and $40,000 grants available, and those can be paired with DOLA technical assistance grants to help cover the lion's share of bringing on a third party to help develop those EV readiness plans. And then the last thing I'll note, Xcel through its transportation electrification plan does have a community EV planning offering through its partners in energy. Those of course are only available to communities in Xcel's territory. Right now they're working with about a dozen different communities around the state, but those are incentives that are available to any community in Xcel's territory. Next slide, please. A second kind of education and technical support tool that I want to highlight for communities on the call is our Recharge Colorado program. So we have partners in 5 different regions across the state. These tend to be nonprofits located in different areas. Some of them are part of the Department of Energy's Clean Cities Coalition. We also work with CLEAR in the Roaring Fork Valley, FORCOR down in Durango, and then the 3 Clean Cities organizations in Northern Colorado metro area and then Southern Colorado. And these are really our boots on the ground in many ways to provide education and technical support to a variety of stakeholders, whether they're consumers, local governments, workplaces, multifamily housing, and others. And they can work to help identify monetary savings, can help provide information and support access to infrastructure grant programs and other programs facilitated by the Energy Office. And they also coordinate a number of education and outreach activities. So if you've ever attended a ride and drive, it was probably organized by a Recharge coach. They also do a lot of informational and educational webinars. And then the last thing that I'll note about Recharge Colorado is we're in the process of bringing on a 6th coach that is really going to focus specifically on helping to increase access to electrification, as well as the programs that are administered by our office to those living in disproportionately impacted communities, those multifamily housing facilities that are serving income qualified tenants, and really helping to make sure that everybody has equitable access to not only electrification of transportation, but also a lot of the state resources that are available to communities in Colorado. Next slide. And then I'll just touch briefly on this slide. Travis talked in his last slide about the infrastructure needs that are required to meet that really aggressive 2030 goal. We have a number of different charging charging infrastructure programs that are available to both public and private entities in Colorado. Now these are funded through a variety of funding sources. I've put an asterisk next to those that are funded through federal funds. Mike is going to talk next about NEVI. Those last 2 programs, our DC Fast Charging Plaza program and our medium and heavy duty program, will be funded primarily through NEVI funding, but each of these are available. The first program, Charge Ahead Colorado, really our flagship program. This is the program that provides incentives to build community-based level 2 and DC fast charging stations, the kinds of stations that allow people to feel comfortable driving an electric vehicle as part of their daily driving needs. The DC Fast Charging Corridors program, of course, is the station that has provided incentives to build out high-speed charging along our major transportation corridors. And then the DC Fast Charging Plazas program really is going to be the program where we allocate the majority of NEVI funding. These are going to be stations built along our designated corridors, at least 4 high-speed charging stations at each station. And the idea really here, of course, is to electrify our major transportation corridors in Colorado, ensure that everybody feels comfortable driving an electric vehicle anywhere in the state. And then next slide, I believe this is my last slide. So I'll just talk briefly. I know there's a lot of interest in e-mobility. The Energy Office was provided $12 million as part of last year's legislative session for e-bikes. So we'll be launching a couple of different offerings in early 2023. One is a grant program that builds off the successful pilot that we did a couple of years ago, providing bikes, electric bikes and equipment to low-income essential workers. We're going to expand the criteria to all low and moderate income Coloradans. And then we'll also be launching a rebate program, a point of sale e-bike rebate, very similar to what Denver has done. And of course, they've been very successful. This will be available anywhere in the state. And then we will also be releasing a grant program. It's a Vehicle Exchange Colorado program designed to provide incentives to purchase electric vehicles for low and moderate income Coloradans, again, with the requirement that they recycle a high emitting vehicle. So imagine kind of a cash for clunkers style program that is focused on low and moderate income Coloradans across the state, also to be released in early 2023. That's all my comments. Happy to answer any questions once we're all done speaking. Thanks.
Okay, I think I'm next up. Thanks, Christian. This is Michael King from the Colorado Department of Transportation. You know, the webinar here is called Beyond NEVI, but we also do want to touch on the NEVI program because it's been getting a lot of attention over the last year or so. This is part of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act that was signed back in 2021. The NEVI program is a $5 billion formula program within the broader IIJA. It is focused, as Christian mentioned, on corridor-based fast charging because it is really looking at this from a national standpoint, seeking to build a national network of EV fast charging across the entire country. Colorado's portion of this funding will be $57 million over the next 5 years. That's the portion that is specific to EV charging. I'll also note that there is another $2.5 billion in discretionary grant funding that is coming through the IIJA. Some of that will be specific to EV charging. Others will be more variety based on other types of fuels as well. But we don't have a lot of information on that yet. So for now, we're going to focus really on the NEVI program. As part of this, each state was required to submit an infrastructure deployment plan to the joint office that manages this program. We did that by August 1st of 2022, and it was approved in September 14th. So we're now moving into the implementation phase. Next slide, please. So some of the key requirements of the NEVI formula program, as I mentioned, the goal is to establish a national network of charging infrastructure across the entire United States. Projects that are funded must be within 1 mile of federally designated electric vehicle corridors, and I will show you those in Colorado in another slide or two. There is a prioritization in the federal program for rural areas, disproportionately impacted communities, as well as support for medium and heavy duty freight and goods movement, which is a little bit further out in the future. Charging stations can be no more than 50 miles apart. That's the goal along a corridor, so that every 50 miles you find a NEVI compliant station, and you can expect a similar level of power and amenities at those. And the focus is on DC fast charging, minimum of 4 150 kilowatt chargers that can charge 4 vehicles simultaneously. And this is above and beyond most of what we see in Colorado today. So these are more ambitious projects looking towards that future market beyond just what is common on the roads today. There is some eligibility for battery storage, renewable generation, and other project elements. And there is also an ability in the program to reimburse operational and maintenance expenses for up to 5 years. Next slide, please. So these are the corridors in Colorado that are designated as alternative fuel corridors at the national level. This means that any of these are eligible for NEVI projects within 1 mile of these corridors. But it's important to note that every other part of the state remains eligible for state funding. So there is no community in Colorado that cannot develop a EV charging project. It's just a matter of whether you would be seeking federal funding, state funding, or in some locations, potentially both. Next slide, please. So this is the same map, but it shows some of our current infrastructure that's out there in the state. The green squares are existing NEVI compliant stations where they already meet that new higher NEVI standard that I talked about. The yellow dots are stations that are geographically along the NEVI corridors, but do not yet meet the power or charger number requirements. So these are opportunities where we might be able to upgrade existing stations to become NEVI compliant. And then the areas with the dotted red lines are the true gaps where there is currently no DC fast charging at all. And these would also be priorities for the state to invest in through the NEVI program, but also through our state grant programs so that we can build out this network and have access to and from every part of the state. Next slide, please. So in terms of where we are in the NEVI process, our plan was approved. We're currently working with the Colorado Energy Office on the interagency agreements needed to manage these programs together. We're working with the Energy Office and other stakeholders to develop a request for application. This will be part of the existing DC fast charging plazas program that the Energy Office has run successfully for several rounds. And so we're expecting that the next RFA that would include these funds as well as state funds would be in the first quarter of 2023, early 2023. And then grantees that are awarded would be responsible for design, construction, maintenance, and operation of charging sites. The state of Colorado does not own and operate charging directly apart from our own buildings. Next slide, please. So a couple notes on transit electrification, separate from NEVI, but of interest to many people in this this webinar. There are existing and future transit grant programs that communities should be aware of. The Volkswagen Settlement Program has been around for about 5 years now, and there is still $9 million remaining in state funds to replace conventionally fueled vehicles with zero-emission vehicles, including battery electrics, like the ones you see on the right there. There's also a new clean transit enterprise that was established last year. This will have $134 million over the next 10 years and will be able to fund vehicle replacement, charging and fueling infrastructure, facility modifications, and planning for transit agencies. And then at the federal level, the FTA 5339C, low or no emission vehicle program, which many people just refer to as LONO, that is a nationally competitive grant program. The previous round had more than $1 billion available across the country. So that's a good fund to pursue, and it can be matched with the other two, the Volkswagen and the Clean Transit Enterprise, to make a project whole. Next slide, please. So we've talked about some of the new programs, but it's also important to note that there is expanded eligibility for existing transportation programs in the IIJA. So for example, you're probably familiar with at the local level, some of these National Highway Performance Program, Surface Transportation Block Grants, Congestion Mitigation and Air Quality Improvement. These programs have been expanded in terms of the eligibility and also clarified by some recent federal highways documents about other types of projects that can be done with these, such as workforce development, EV planning, public charging, transit capital, and transit charging. So it's important not just to look at the new money, but also consider some of the existing funds that you might have experienced working with and whether there might be new project possibilities in those funds that you haven't considered in the past. Next slide, please. One thing to note about that, of course, when you have a new grant program that is specific to EV charging, it attracts a lot of attention, but there's less competition because that's the only thing it can be used for. Some of these grant programs or these funds that I just referred to on the last slide, you might be competing with other eligible uses such as resurfacing or bike and pedestrian projects or other priorities for your community. So while it does create new opportunities, it might also be a conversation with your colleagues about how to prioritize different project needs when there's different things you can spend that money on. There is typically a 20% match required for any federal grant program, so that's another thing to consider. And one of the opportunities here is to stack funding from different sources, state plus federal, or state plus enterprise, federal plus enterprise. There are different ways that you can make a project more achievable by looking at multiple funding sources. But of course, when we talk about federal dollars, there are also requirements that come along, such as Davis-Bacon, Buy America. So it's important to understand the restrictions on those and work with the state on how to make a project a success. And finally, there are some additional programs that you might consider. We don't have time to go into all of these today, but Colorado State Infrastructure Bank, there's innovative and financing credit assistance, there's block grants, tribal governments are eligible for additional programs that we haven't mentioned here. And then there are new programs coming from the federal government and others in 2023, such as the Carbon Reduction Program and those NEVI discretionary grants that I mentioned before. So this is a snapshot in time. There's more coming, there's more information coming, but it's important to understand there are a lot of opportunities out there, and starting to think about how you can mix and match them to accomplish your goals as a community. Next slide, please.
Awesome. And speaking of those new incentives, it's a perfect bridge. I just wanted to take a minute to chat through some of the new Inflation Reduction Act incentives, which are plentiful. Many of these are seen in the form of tax credits. You can see those listed at the top, and similar to what was discussed before, there are a lot of requirements, income caps. As years go by, Buy America will come into effect. But these are great things to know about and great things to understand. In light of how both you as an individual and someone who's helping to lead your community can qualify for more or less money off of these awesome new cars and service equipment. And then also in terms of new funding, I just listed a few of the tons of funding opportunities. These felt, sort of relevant to what we were talking about here today. So that's electric school bus rebates, heavy duty truck rebates, the GHG reduction fund, and then environmental and climate justice block grants. And I'm happy to talk more about any of those or any of the other funding opportunities that you might have heard of. And I'll also share with you that in the coming days, the EC is going to release a tool about how to make sense of all of these funding opportunities. So I'll leave it there for now, and we'll be excited to answer any more questions.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Rebecca. Thank you, Christian. Thank you, Michael, for that excellent overview. That leaves us about 25 minutes, a healthy chunk of time to go over any questions that you all in the audience might have. And I think the easiest way to do this will be to have folks put questions in the chat, and we'll take them as they come. I see the first question from Lee Yancey. Do Travis or Christian know what the predicted EV adoption rate is for the market by 2030 without any added local government involvement? I guess I can take a shot at that, Christian, and then if you want to jump in. But my personal feeling is that we are on the high adoption track. Like if you look at where we're at right now in 2022, it lines up with that high adoption line. And given the all of the policy extensions that happened in the IRA and the hundreds of billions of dollars that vehicle companies are investing in the new models and upgrading their supply chains, I'm optimistic that we're going to get to a point where EVs are easier to acquire. And if I had to guess, I would predict the high adoption track. But obviously, we're going to need local governments to enable that by making investments in the charging infrastructure necessary to support all those vehicles and to make it possible for people to take their EVs and use them for the purposes that they currently use their combustion vehicles for. And Christian, welcome any thoughts you have.
Yeah, Travis, I would actually maybe respond to the second half of the question around kind of that 2030 goal. The 940,000 electric vehicles, as I said, is quite aggressive. That's a lot of electric vehicles, but it still only represents about 15% of actual light duty stock. So, to the question of is 30% of EVs registered by 2030 aggressive enough? That's quite aggressive when you're looking at a stock number, but it would probably be insufficient if we were talking about new market share. So as I mentioned in my comments, the 2030 goal is 940,000 EVs by 2030 and 70% of new electric vehicle sales by 2030. So that 940 is really a stock number, about 15 to 17% of all light duty vehicles on the road.
Thanks, Christian. Next question is from Dallas Blaney. Is there any funding coming to support charger maintenance?
Sure, I'll answer that. So our programs, let me say our programs traditionally for those, the Plaza program and the Corridor program, we actually require that as part of the grant application, a grantee commit to at least 5 years of funded operations and maintenance, and that's now a requirement through Charge Ahead Colorado. So for any of the grants that we provide through the Energy Office for any of those programs, not only is our operations and maintenance, and I should specify when I'm talking operations and maintenance, I'm not talking about electricity. I'm talking about maintenance of those stations, whether we're talking about warranties, whether we're talking about warranty repairs, that sort of thing. Not only is funding available, but it's actually a condition of accepting the grant. We know that reliability is a serious issue, and so we want to make sure that our grantees take it seriously and have protection in place to ensure that equipment is operational for at least 5 years, if not longer.
Michael, there's a reliability requirement within the NEVI program, correct?
Yes, yeah, there's what they refer to as an uptime requirement. So as Christian indicated, we incorporate that into our grant programs. We also can help to, as he said, pay for some of the costs of the warranties to make sure that the site host has access to that service when they need it. There's also an element to this this issue that I think somebody else refers to in the chat about just the companies available to do this sort of work. One of the things that as a state we're attempting to do is start building a foundation of workforce development in the EV space as well. So funding projects and vehicle replacements and all that is important, but we're also trying to work with community colleges and the private sector to make sure that there are enough people trained in these skills so that when you do need to use that warranty, there is somebody in Colorado with the skills to go either repair your charger or your vehicle, whatever the case may be, so that it's not just built into the program and funded, but it's also quick and timely, and the person knows how to do their job safely and effectively.
Looks like there's a follow-up question relevant here. Is there a number of mature EV charging station companies that will compete for maintenance contracts of equipment here in the state of Colorado?
Well, it's interesting. One of the things that we've been pleasantly surprised with over the last couple of years are the number of new entrance to the charging market in Colorado. And so while, maybe 3 or 4 years ago, we would have had a hard time finding a developer willing to make that upfront investment in rural part of the state, we're seeing increasingly a lot of providers that are willing to do that. Now, they typically bring the operations and maintenance as part of their proposal, but it is something that I think we're increasingly aware of is as new entrants enter the market, they may not have the network of maintenance contracts in place. So on the one hand, we welcome new players to Colorado's market, but we need to be, I think, diligent in making sure that they have the relationships, that they have the maintenance contracts in place to ensure timely repair of equipment, because without that, you could have a station down for days, if not weeks. So I think it is incumbent upon us to do our own due diligence, ensuring that those maintenance contracts or those maintenance relationships are in place. But I think it is certainly an evolving market from that perspective.
Thanks. Looks like this next question is for Rebecca or others. Is there guidance in the new local government playbook or elsewhere on best practices on EV charging fees to cover maintenance and electricity costs?
Yeah, thanks for that question. A couple notes on that. First and foremost, we recommend to keep costs as low as possible to make stations accessible for folks to use. We also recommend, although not in the playbook, but aligned with the NEVI guidance, that stations don't have membership fees and folks don't need to, jump through extra hoops to use stations, so that you can, drive up to a station and tap a credit card and plug in. And then in terms of covering electricity costs and covering maintenance, et cetera, we don't have specific guidance on that in the playbook, but I'm also, happy to share that we talk a lot about working with community and working with utilities and working with external stakeholders to help understand, where folks can match costs and how we can bring in additional investment into charging.
Do you have anything to add, Michael or Christian?
No,
Okay.
I think it's fair to say that the state has not played a very active role so far in kind of certainly never requiring any sort of price structure, but we are very interested in helping to collect best practices and share those among communities and site hosts so that they can understand, the best approach for their community.
Thanks. Looks like Winnie Del Quadri put some information from a Steamboat Springs community survey that I think points toward the idea that lots of people are thinking about buying EVs. The number that jumps out to me there is that 54% of residents are considering buying an EV in the next 2 to 5 years. I think that certainly aligns with my feeling that we're on a high adoption track. Next question I see is from Ari Snow. Is the state doing anything to help alleviate supply chain constraints with the specialized equipment needed for these projects? I just did a pre-construction meeting today with Excel, and timeline to receive a new transformer is still 6 to 9 months out. That actually sounds shorter than what I've heard in some other places, but Michael or Christian, do you want to take that one?
I would say, unfortunately, we're at the mercy of those same supply chain constraints, whether it's, we have a number of projects that are in progress at state facilities that are experiencing, charging equipment delays. And I think transformers are even, I mean, we've heard, gosh, I heard 2 years the other day for some types of transformers. And I think we've certainly seen that through our charging infrastructure programs. We've had to extend many projects that transformers are delayed. It's difficult to find an electrician. You kind of name it right now. So I think patience is going to be required over the next couple of years, and we should just assume that the projects are going to take longer than we certainly hope, and sort of plan for 18-month to 2-year timeframes. I think is particularly for the DC fast charging projects.
Yeah, and I think that for me anyway, just highlights the importance of planning, so that like the earlier you have a roadmap in place for what you want to do, the easier it will be to deal with you can start earlier, like way before you actually need the project to be operational, and maybe that will ease some of the concerns. And then I guess I'm also optimistic that some of the policies that are in the Inflation Reduction Act will have an effect on the supply chain constraints, particularly with microchips and domestic batteries. Transformers, I don't know as much about. Looks like Lee is offering some advice to Colin. It's not a question. Okay. Next question from Stacy Brendel for Rebecca. Are the IRA incentives and rebates only community facing, or can municipalities apply for these?
Great question. Thanks for asking it. And yes, municipalities can apply for some of them. There are a ton of incentives and rebates in the Inflation Reduction Act, and they are all like geared intentionally towards different folks. So Stacey, I'm happy to follow up separately and sort of help you with the ones that are more geared towards municipalities. But the answer to your question is yes.
Excellent. So if there are further questions, please add them to the chat. I'm going to read a couple maybe that we got from that came in during the webinar registration. There's a question about public-private partnerships. What opportunities for public-private partnerships exist on building the charger network? And I guess I'd be interested to hear what you have to say about that, Christian or Michael, but my gut feeling is that every single project is a public-private partnership, because you need a site host, you need a utility, and there are often multiple players contributing resources to make a project a success. But do you have any thoughts to add, Christian or Michael?
I would agree with your general statement that there's both elements, and then utilities can be sort of public/private. They're kind of in the gray area sometimes. And yeah, I think it looks different in every community. In some communities, the municipality itself might own and operate level 2 charging, or even DC fast charging. Some of the electric utilities own and operate their own charging. Sometimes a community prefers to be a site host because they have access to land, parks, parking lots, public buildings, and then they find a private company to own and operate the infrastructure itself. So it really is, I think, part of that planning discussion that you want to have in the EV readiness process. What does your community want its role to be? Who are the other folks that you might partner with? How do they see their roles? And then finding how it all fits together in a given project or a given geography. But it is different in every case, and it really is, I think, up to the community to determine what makes the most sense for the local context and users.
All right. Another question. Is anyone keeping track of out of service chargers? And I guess as an EV driver myself, my main experience with that has been like using the app for whatever brand of charger it is to report an issue. But Christian, is there, how does that work with the, like the charge ahead stations?
I would say that we have so all stations are required to remain operational for at least 5 years. We've undertaken an effort to better understand what we can do to support reliability, because, you know, actually, let me step back for a second, Travis, because I presented on this at a conference a while back, and reliability was one of the key items that we talked about. And, you know, if you read the national literature, in any given community or any given state, the number of chargers down varies somewhere between 30 and 60%. So 30 to 60% of chargers in most states are down on any given day. Yeah, it's terrible, right? I shouldn't even say that out loud. But in Colorado, we did an analysis recently, and it was closer to 15. Now, that's still much higher than we want to see, but 15 is significantly better. And we think that's in large part because of not only the requirements we place on grantees to our program, particularly for DC fast charging, but also because we've always made that operations and maintenance warranty an eligible cost. That's not the case with a lot of programs. And so I think there's certainly more that we can do. We are now, as I mentioned earlier, making it a requirement even of Charge Ahead Colorado, which wasn't traditionally the case. We're looking at whether or not we can partner with our recharge coaches to do audits of charging stations, to make sure that we're more proactive in communicating when they're down. I think if there are other ideas about what we can be doing through our grant program or otherwise to ensure reliability of that equipment, we're really all ears, because if we don't have a charging station network that is reliable, it really reduces the confidence, I think, in the general public, and obviously hampers our ability to meet our long-term electric vehicle goals. So I think we're doing a lot already, but there's certainly more that we can do, and happy to, you know, take recommendations or thoughts or additional questions on how we might improve the reliability of Colorado's charging network.
All right, there's another question from the registration here. I'll go to the registration, and then if there's more questions in the chat, please let me know. So I think this one might be for Michael. What advice do you have for communities that are outside the 1 mile radius of an alt fuel corridor for how to access future EV charging funding?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's understandable that based on all the media attention that NEVI has been getting, that people might feel like if they're not on that list of corridors, they're not eligible. But in Colorado, every part of the state is eligible for EV charging grants. So the DC Fast Charging Plazas program, we're going to be putting the NEVI funding into that program, managing the grants through that program, but there will also be state funds in there. So if your community is not within 1 mile of an eligible corridor, you can still apply to that same program. Your project can still be funded, and you'll just be receiving state dollars instead of federal dollars. And to be honest, in a lot of ways, state dollars are preferable to federal dollars because they tend to have fewer strings attached, less documentation. So if that's your concern, that shouldn't be a concern. I think the focus really should be on how do you develop a plan and identify the key projects that will be successful. And then if you've done that, the staff at the state and our partners like SWEEP will be able to help you navigate to the grant program that will be able to support your project.
Thanks, Michael. Another question. Are there any other federal grants available for local governments to do planning or design work to help electrify non-transit fleet vehicles and also acquire the necessary charging infrastructure?
So Christian might know if there are any specific grants that are just for that purpose, but as we talked about in some of the slides, existing transportation planning and transportation infrastructure programs, such as the Carbon Reduction Program, Surface Transportation Block Grants, etc., those could be used for EV related activities. So If you can use it to develop a transportation plan, you may be able to use it to develop a transportation electrification plan. And likewise with the transit funding through the Federal Transit Administration, to my knowledge, pretty much anything that is in FTA that you can use for a combustion bus or a fueling station or a facility could be used for a zero emission bus, fueling station, charging station facility. So it's more a matter of how do you prioritize available resources in some of those cases, as opposed to applying to a brand new EV only grant program. Christian, do you know of any federal specific planning grant opportunities?
I don't, Mike, I'm sorry.
There are a few, and if anyone's interested, you should reach out, and I'm happy to discuss more. There are a few that are planning focused, specifically focused on rural communities that I can think of off the top of my head.
Another question in the chat from Jeff Grimmer. What intentionality have you seen in terms of designing EV infrastructure to support local business corridors with increased customer traffic? I think that would be part of the local community EV planning process and deciding what parts of communities to site chargers in. Are there any good examples of that from communities in Colorado that you know about, Michael or Christian, or from elsewhere in the country, Rebecca?
I can say that within Colorado, we've definitely seen site hosts that in their grant applications or in their plans talk about providing an amenity to boost customer dwell time or to attract customers. So currently a lot of the DC fast charging that we see in Colorado is at big box stores, Walmart, Target, REI, places like that, where the charging is designed to attract people that then spend time in the store. We've also seen in a slightly different context with we have a carve out program of Charge Ahead Colorado that is focused on scenic byways and rural tourist destinations. That's definitely a case in which attracting visitors to a community by putting charging there is something that a lot of the grantees are looking at. On a more community scale, about where in your community do you put charging to boost consumer spending or attract customers? I don't know if I've seen as many kind of scientific approach to that so much, but Rebecca may have examples from other places where, or Christian, any thoughts on that?
No, I just, it's an interesting sort of dilemma that we sometimes face as a funding agency, and that, we obviously feel a lot of urgency to fill gaps in the charging market. Sometimes the application proposals that we receive do that, but maybe they aren't in the most opportune of all places. And so we certainly see the charging infrastructure not only providing a benefit to drivers, but also potentially an economic development opportunity for communities. And so I think I agree 100% with Michael that that's really where this idea of proactive community planning really makes sense, because we don't want to be in a position of rejecting an application that fills a gap because it's not in a perfect location. On the other hand, where this proactive planning identifies locations within a community's main street, perhaps, or other areas where there's access to amenities, then we think that those kinds of projects can help tick multiple boxes, from increasing access to charging to helping to support economic development to helping to support Colorado's tourist economy. So I think that proactive planning can really be vital in ensuring that we get applications for really good projects that meet a lot of community needs.
From my own personal experience, I've definitely spent more time at the ice cream shop in Fairplay than I did before I had an EV.
And Travis, I think you make an awesome point. If we talking about proactive planning and talking about stakeholder engagement, working with the local ice cream shop or working with the local REI is, not only an awesome way to ensure that there's, wider spread charging, but it's also a great way to make sure that there's widespread adoption. You're much more likely to feel confident about an EV if you're going to roll up to your local ice cream shop and see a charger there and inquire and ask questions and, understand all these benefits than you are if they're not there. So it's a really important point.
Let me add one more thing to that, and that is that, particularly when we're talking about these NEVI funded stations, yes, there's a lot of money available, but they all require a match. And when we're talking about 4 150 kilowatt charging stations, even with that match, you're talking about a fairly sizable investment up front. And so, it's typically not going to be something that a small mom and pop or, for example, is going to be able to potentially afford. So again, that pre-planning, identifying potential site hosts, identifying potential investors up front, I think ensures that we get stations in the kinds of locations, again, that kind of meet the needs that we're all talking about here.
All right. I think maybe we could squeeze in one last question before we wrap it up. Can you remind me the status of the state's partnership with ride-hailing companies and what EV charging infrastructure funding supports these fleets specifically? Christian, are you?
Yeah, I'll start with that. That was actually the genesis for the Plaza program. Was it was initially limited to the metro area. It was initially focused on providing charging infrastructure for high mileage fleets, as well as secondarily to those that lack access to home charging. We have since expanded that, but even so, that is one consideration in our evaluation criteria, is looking at what end uses those charging stations are looking to serve. So at least from an infrastructure perspective, we want to make sure that we have charging in those locations where that help to encourage electrification of fleets, high mileage fleets like Lyft and Uber, for instance. But they're also there to serve the general public. In terms of the individual ride-hailing companies, I think they both have really aggressive goals for electrification. I think they're both pursuing those in very different ways.
I think that might be all the time we have for today's webinar. I appreciate everyone's attendance and attention, and a special thank you to Michael, Christian, and Rebecca for all the great information you shared. Appreciate you very much.